Chapter 4. After the Unmaskings. Cynical Twilight. Sketches for the Self-repudiation of the Ethos of Enlightenment. Quoting Goethe's Faust I, Walpurgisnacht. You are still there. No, that is unheard of. Disappear. We have, after all, enlightened. The pack of devils. It does not ask for rules. We are clever enough, and still Tegel is haunted. Quoting Erich Kästner's Fabian from 1931. I look on. Is that nothing? Or who can be helped by it? Who can be helped? Said Fabian. Quoting Ernst Ottwald's Den sie wissen, was sie tun from 1931. For they know not what they do. These 8 turbulent and hard-won advances of reflective enlightenment have made history, just like the great breakthroughs in natural science and technology, with which they have combined in the last 250 years into a permanent industrial and cultural revolution. Just as urbanization, motorization, electrification, and the information revolution have radically altered life and societies, so the labour of reflection and critique has structurally broken up consciousness and forced a new dynamic constitution on them. Nothing is solid anymore. It has ploughed up an intellectual psychic field on which old forms of tradition, identity, and character can no longer exist. Its effects add up to the complex of a modernity in which life knows itself to be at the mercy of a continuum of crisis. Enlightened prevention of enlightenment. Enlightenment has certainly been enormously successful. In its arsenal, the weapons of critique stand ready. Those who want to view these, even in isolation, would have to think that a party so armed would inevitably win this struggle of opinions. But no party can appropriate these weapons solely for itself. Critique does not have a unified bearer, but rather is splintered into a multitude of schools, factions, currents, avant-gardes. Basically, there is no unified and unambiguous Enlightenment movement. One feature of the dialect of Enlightenment is that it was never able to build a massive front. Rather, early on it developed, so to speak, into its own opponent. As shown in the second preliminary reflection, Enlightenment is broken by the resistance of opposing powers, hegemonic power, tradition, prejudice. Because knowledge is power, every hegemonic power challenged by another knowledge must try to stay in the centre of knowledge. However, not every power is the right centre for every knowledge. Reflective knowledge cannot be separated from its subject. Thus, only one means remains available to hegemonic powers: to separate the subjects of possible oppositional power from the means of their self-reflection. For the age-old history of violence against ideas. It is violence neither against persons, nor against things in the trivial sense. It is violence against the self-experience and the self-expression of persons who are in danger of learning what they should not know. The history of censorship can be summarized in this phrase. It is the history of the politics of anti-reflection. At that moment when people become ripe for experiencing the truth about themselves and their social relations, those in power have always tried to smash the mirrors in which people would recognize who they are and what is happening to them. Enlightenment, no matter how impotent the mere means of reason seem, is subtly irresistible, like the light after which, in sound mystical tradition, it is named les lumières, illumination. Light is unable to reach only those places where obstacles block its rays. Thus Enlightenment tries first to light the lamps, and then to clear the obstacles out of the way that prevent the light's diffusion. In and of itself, light cannot have any enemies. It thinks of itself as a peacefully illuminating energy. It becomes bright where surfaces reflect it. The question will be, are these reflecting surfaces really the final targets of illumination? Or are these surfaces interposed between the source of enlightenment and its intended recipients? In the language of the 18th century Freemasons, the obstacles that disturbed or blocked the light of knowledge had a threefold name: superstition, error, and ignorance. They were also called the three monsters. These monsters were real powers with which one had to contend, and which the Enlightenment took it upon itself to provoke and overcome. Enthusiastically and naively, the early Enlighteners presented themselves to the powers that be in the name of their struggle for light, and demanded free passage. However, they never really got a clear view of the fourth monster, the actual and most difficult opponent. They attacked the powerful, but not their knowledge. They often neglected to investigate systematically the knowledge of domination and the hegemonic powers. This knowledge always has the structure of a double knowledge, one for the rules of conduct of power, and one for the norms of general consciousness. The consciousness of those who rule is that reflecting surface that is decisive for the course and diffusion of enlightenment. Thus enlightenment brings power truly to reflection for the first time. Power reflects in the double sense of the word, as self-observation and as refraction, Brechung, and return, Zurücksendung, of the light. Zurücksendung. Those who rule, if they are not merely arrogant, must place themselves studiously between enlightenment and its addresses in order to prevent the diffusion of a new power of knowledge and the genesis of a new subject of knowledge about power. The state must know the truth before it can censor it. The tragedy of the old social democracy is that, of the 100 meanings of the statement, knowledge is power, it had consciously recognized only a few. It continually failed to recognize which knowledge it is that really gives power, and what kind of power one must be and have in order to gain the knowledge that expands power. In French conservatism and royalism of the 19th and 20th centuries, there occasionally was resentful speculation about how the revolution of 1789 could have been avoided. This reactionary gossip has at least one very interesting aspect. Monarchical conservatism hits the nerve of a cynically studious politics of hegemonic power. The train of thought is very simple. If the monarchy had fully exhausted its capacities for reform, if it had learned to deal flexibly with the facts of the bourgeois economic order, if it had made the new economy the basis of its domestic policy, etc., then perhaps things would not have had to happen as they did. Royalists, if they are intelligent, would be the first to admit that Louis XV and Louis XVI were partly responsible through their mistakes and political impotence for the disaster. But they by no means therefore renounce the idea of monarchy as such, because they justifiably assume the possibility of a despotism capable of learning. The politically hollow head of France in the 18th century allowed knowledge about power to form an extra-monarchical centre. If one looks more closely, the chain of events of the actual revolutionary happenings begins with a touching and oppressive display. The hegemonic power tried at the last moment to approximate the people's knowledge about its problems, in order to take back the reins which had slipped from its grasp. This is the significance of those famous complaint books that, on the eve of the revolution and at the bidding of the crown, were supposed to be written by every county and borough, so that in the highest places the real distress and wishes of the people could finally become known. In an act of patriarchal humility, whereby the people played their role with high hopes and a political erotic beating of the heart, the monarchy conceded that it needed to learn more. It let it be known that from then on it was willing to become also the centre of that knowledge and of those political needs whose splintering off into a revolutionary centre it had tolerated for too long. But precisely in doing this, the Crown set the ball of a revolutionary causality rolling, for whom momentum the system had no inherent brake. In the great continental monarchies of the 18th century, a different style of government had prevailed, a patriarchal Enlightenment. The monarchies of Prussia, Austria, and Russia had leaders who were willing to learn. Thus one talks of an Enlightenment under Peter, Frederick, and Joseph, whereas one cannot, much as one might like to, speak of an Enlightenment under Louis. In the countries of enlightened despotism, a semi-conservative development planning was effected from above. From this planning emanated, in the final analysis, the impulse for modern planning ideas, which everywhere attempted to combine a maximum of social stability with a maximum expansion of power and production. Contemporary socialist systems still work completely in the style of enlightened absolutism, which calls itself democratic centralism, or a dictatorship of the proletariat, or whatever other euphemisms there are. In these things the German example has an ambivalent prominence. Nevertheless, German Enlightenment does possess not only representatives such as Lessing and Kant, but also Frederick II of Prussia, who must be counted among the clever minds of the century. As a prince, he was completely a child of the age of Enlightenment, and author of an anti-Machiavelli text who condemned the openly cynical technique of domination in the older statecraft. As a monarch, he had to become the most self-reflective embodiment of modernizing knowledge about ruling. In his political philosophy, the new clothes of power were tailored. The art of repression was schooled in the zeitgeist. Frederick's new cynicism was camouflaged by melancholy, because he strove for personal integrity by trying to apply the Prussian ascetic politics of obedience to himself. With a formal, and partly also with an existential consistency, he transferred the idea of service to the crown, designating the king the first servant of the state. Here the depersonalization of power begins, and it reaches its peak in modern bureaucracy. Frederick's melancholy shows how in enlightened despotism, a certain tragic tone must emerge, a tone, incidentally, that lent many admirers of Prussia a secret, sentimental identity. It still feeds the present-day nostalgia for Prussia, this outgrowth of a social liberal bureaucratic romanticism. The German Enlightenment, more than any other, senses the schizoid split in itself. It knows about things that it may not live out. It possesses a knowledge whose real subject it cannot be. It absorbs insights in order to prevent them from advancing to the egos, which would without fail act according to them, if they only possessed them. In this schizoid melancholy, the main thread of recent German history already begins to unravel. The demoralization of bourgeois enlightenment by an intelligent hegemonic power. Otto von Bismarck was the second great cynical force in German modernity, a figure of repression highly capable of thinking. As creator of the Delayed Nation, 1871, he was at the same time the one who tried to turn back the domestic political clock of the nation by half a century. He undertook the denial of evolution on a grand scale. He strove to maintain standards for the political denial of rights that no longer corresponded to the balance and sources of power in his time. He repressed not only the political will of the old Fourth Estate, which had long since begun to articulate itself in social democracy, but also that of the Third Estate, of of bourgeois liberalism. Bismarck hated liberalism. Freisinn, the sense of freedom, possibly even more than the red hordes of social democracy. Even in political Catholicism, the Centre Party, he sensed the claim to a political ego that provoked his cynicism. The place where these political egos wanted to speak their mind, the Prussian Parliament, later the Reichsparlament, he called realistically and contemptuously a gossip shop. For the real decisions were always made solely by him and the Crown. Here, the main thread of German masters' cynicism becomes a strong rope. Reason and argue as much as you want, but obey. Here the road begins that leads from the gossip shop of Bismarck's time to the demoralised and chaotic parliamentarism of the Weimar period. It remains to be considered whether in social democratic periods the diffusion of identity of Enlightenment must proceed more strongly than ever. As soon as enlightened governments are established, the schizoid tension within the subject of power is intensified. The subject must split off its own knowledge of Enlightenment and get involved in the melancholy realism of governing. It must learn the art of the second worst evil. No merely moral consciousness and no loyalty to principles that will be able to cope with the intricate realisms of the exercise of power. Not without intention, I explained in the preface that the critique of cynical reason is a meditation on the statement, knowledge is power. It was a slogan of the old social democracy. The critique as a whole thus leads to a meditative grounding and dissolution of the core of social democracy, pragmatic political reason. As pragmatics, it respects the given order against which, as reason, it continues to revolt. Only under the sign of a critique of cynicism can the worn-out contraposition of theory and praxis be suspended. Only it can leave the schoolboy dialectic of ideal and reality behind. Under the sign of a critique of cynical reason, Enlightenment can gain a new lease on life and remain true to its most intimate project, the transformation of being through consciousness. To continue Enlightenment means to be prepared for the fact that everything that in consciousness is mere morality will lose out against the unavoidable amoralism of the real. Is this not what social democracy is learning today, in that, almost against its will, it is becoming caught up in the great dialectic? This pain of learning is one of the three main factors in the self-denial of present-day Enlightenment. Enlightenment experiences its main refractive break, Berechnung, in the political cynicism of the hegemonic powers. For knowledge is power, and power, when forced to fight, leads to the splitting of knowledge into livable and non-livable knowledge. This appears only superficially as an opposition between realism and idealism. In truth, a schizoid and an anti-schizoid realism oppose each other here. The first appears respectable, the second, cheeky. The first assumes responsibility for what one cannot be responsible for. The second irresponsibly champions the cause for what one can be responsible for. The first, so it says, wants to secure survival. The second wants to save the dignity of life from the encroachments of the realism of power.